KAZU, Pacific Grove, Monterey Bay Public Radio. This is Mae Brussell. The title of my broadcast is World Watchers. This is program number 842, January the 25th, 1988. Before I begin the program, I want to say that the views expressed here are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kazoo staff or board of directors. This hour of World Watchers is made possible in part by Aries Arts in the heart of Capitola Village, serving Santa Cruz's growing consciousness for over 20 years. Last week, following my program on World Watchers, the references to Martin Luther King, being Martin Luther King Day, there was another program that followed mine on this station, and it was a symposium of three people that had a conference in Santa Cruz, and it was played on this program following the World Watchers. And I have never done this before, but I want to discuss just for a few moments the nature of a comment of one of the people on that panel, because I refuse to sit back and take ignorance or lies passed off as lies to perpetuate those stories, just as I had on my broadcast, quoting a gentleman who edited the book of James Earl Ray, Tennessee Waltz, Mr. Tauper, who said that when you learn lies, you pass lies on and you deny yourself truth. A gentleman, as part of a symposium by the name of Page Smith, was described on the program as a founding faculty member from the University of California, Santa Cruz. I understand he's been off of the campus for a long time, but came on as a professor, and I would assume that being the birthday of Martin Luther King, he would have something pertinent to say. The broadcast had to do with nonviolence, the voter registration in the South, and then at one point he managed to get in the usual slur, which we always hear so often, that Martin Luther King, he passed off, was just killed by some lone person, not for reasons political or having anything to do with King's growing opposition to the war in Vietnam. Now, this program was taped and made possible by Resource Center for Nonviolence in Santa Cruz. And just to set the history straight, because that's what I want to do, having done 23 years of research, 20 years on the Martin Luther King assassination, I want to remind you listeners of just a few pages of the report of the Select Committee on Assassinations, the U.S. House of Representatives, 95th Congress, second session, House Report number 951825, Part 2. The House Select Committee on Assassinations was put together in 1977, 1978. $6 million was allocated to find out who had killed John Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King. As part of their findings, they concluded that in regards to John Kennedy's assassination, and that didn't come up, but I might refresh your memory because it's part of this same report, that there was a high probability that two gunmen fired at President John Kennedy, that other scientific evidence does not preclude the possibility of two gunmen firing at the president. Scientific evidence negates some specific conspiracy allegations, but some exist. The committee believes on the basis of the evidence available, that means part that they didn't go into, but just what was available, that President John Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. The committee was unable to identify the other gunmen, men, plural, gunmen, or the extent of the conspiracy. So that means even if it were Lee Harvey Oswald, it wasn't, then there were at least two others, and they acknowledged the other gunmen or the extent of the conspiracy. And then they went into the fact that the committee believes on the basis of the evidence available, anti-Castro Cubans as a group per se were not involved, but available evidence does not preclude the possibility that individual members of the anti-Castro Cuban group were involved. And the committee, on the basis of the evidence given to it, went into the National Syndicate of Organized Crime. And as a group, they didn't kill John Kennedy. They were not involved in the assassination, but the available evidence does not preclude the possibility that individual members of organized crime were involved. The committee went on to say the Select Committee on Assassinations regarding John Kennedy, the Secret Service possessed information that was not properly analyzed, investigated, or used by the Secret Service in connection with President Kennedy's trip to Dallas. The Department of Justice failed to exercise initiative in supervising and directing the investigation of the FBI. the FBI performed with various degrees of competency in the fulfillment of their duties. The FBI failed to investigate adequately the possibility of a conspiracy to assassinate John Kennedy. The Central Intelligence Agency was deficient in its collection and sharing of information prior to and subsequent to the assassination. And they wrote in conclusion about the fact that the Warren Commission failed to investigate adequately the possibility of a conspiracy to assassinate the president. This deficiency was attributed in part to the failure of the commission to receive all relevant information that was in the possession of other government agencies, departments, and the government. And regarding the assassination of Martin Luther King, they threw out the story of James Earl Ray's alibi on Rowell because they didn't go into it and didn't go into the David Graeber connections. They said the committee believes on the basis of their circumstantial evidence available that there's likelihood that James Earl Ray did assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King as the part of a conspiracy. They investigated Ray's motives and the general indications of a conspiracy, transactions as evidence of a conspiracy, including his leaving the Missouri State Penitentiary, escape being in quotes, of course. The committee believes on the basis of the evidence available that no private organization or individuals other than those discussed were involved in the assassination, and they ran down the right-wing extremist organizations, the Minutemen, the Klan, J.B. Stoner, the conspiracy allegations in Memphis, conspiracy allegations in New Orleans, the conspiracy allegations in Atlanta, the conspiracy allegations in Birmingham, conspiracy allegations in Louisville, Kentucky, conspiracy allegations in St. Louis, Missouri, conspiracy allegations in Miami, and in Texas and New York. It's funny that the House Select Committee, headed by G. Robert Blakey, no flaming liberal, he's the attorney for Mo Dalitz, who shared housing in Las Vegas with Robert Mayu of the FBI, CIA, who set up assassination death squads for the intelligence community. These groups aren't afraid to use the conspiracy, but the so-called persons passing as leftist or middle or concerned jump at the word conspiracy, where the House Select Committee used it over and over again. They said the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation performed with varying degrees of competency and legality in the fulfillment of their duties. The Department of Justice failed to supervise adequately domestic intelligence division of the FBI. In addition, the FBI, in the domestic COINTEL program against Dr. King, grossly abused and exceeded their legal authority and failed to consider the possibility that their actions were threatening bodily harm to Dr. King and could be encouraged by their program. The Department of Justice of the FBI performed a thorough investigation into James Earl Ray and the assassination of Dr. King, but failed to investigate adequately the possibility of conspiracy in the assassination. The FBI manifested a lack of concern for constitutional rights in the manner in which it conducted parts of the investigation, and they came to the conclusion with the information they had that there was a conspiracy in that case also. This is the problem with the universities, these so-called houses of learning, places of learning. The professors go on passing the lies to the students, or the lies to the young generation that come along that want to know what happened, or even if they don't want to know, they should be told about the negligence of these agencies and their role in encouraging somebody to kill Martin Luther King if he didn't kill himself. So I just want to say that it is a gross mistake to allow people, at least within earshot of my experiences, to tell these lies, because no matter where they are, I will try to make them account for them. The same goes for KCBS up in San Francisco this past week. There was a broadcast on the occult and Satanism and child abuse, and there were two so-called experts from Marin County and one from San Francisco, and they waltzed around the question of Michael Aquino and his Church of Set and his worship of Satanism and his love for Nazis and rituals in Himmler's castle. And when asked about Aquino's affiliations, his political ideology, one of the experts says that he was attached to the philosophy of Egypt. Well, his rituals were not around the pyramids. They were in Himmler's castle. And this is the way the so-called experts throw you a whammy to divert you from the truth, and the lies can keep perpetuating themselves, and that is what we have to live with. There was a very small but interesting article in the newspaper, San Francisco Chronicle, this past week. Helene von Damme criticizes the new ambassador to Vienna. Helene von Damme is a woman that worked with Ronald Reagan for 8 years in California, making appointments for him. She was a translator for TCI, that Transcomputer International. The president of that organization was from the Waffen-SS, Otto von Bolschwing. This week, she is objecting to the fact that Henry Grunwald, a Jew, is being sent to Austria to be the ambassador. Von Damme, who began her career, I'm reading the Chronicle, in government service as a personal secretary to Ronald Reagan, said Grunwald doesn't have any diplomatic experience and Grunwald is Jewish. This disqualifies him for the job because he will be unable to be emotionally detached to the land of Kurt Waldheim. Now, that is interesting because when Ronald Reagan became president, he was very indebted to a man named Theodore Cummings. Cummings came from Austria, just as these other appointees came from, Mr. Grunwald came from Austria. And he made a big grocery business fortune in Los Angeles, the food giants and the Frosty Freeze stores, the soft ice cream stores. He sold the whole group of businesses for $52 million. And he was a big contributor to the politics of the Republican Party and Ronald Reagan. So as soon as Reagan became president, Von Damme was helping him make appointments in Washington, this transition team and so forth. He was sent to Austria as the ambassador to Austria. And at the time, the CIA knew about the Nazi record of Kurt Waldheim in Austria. And Mr. Ted Cummings went there, and after 3 months, he had a heart attack. That's what they said. It was a heart attack. And he was sent to Los Angeles to Mount Sinai Hospital. He had contributed millions of dollars to the hospital, actually $65 million for a fundraising for Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. And he was sent there to that hospital. Ted Cummings and his wife were good friends of my parents. My father was in the hospital at the same time Ted Cummings was there. My father had a gallbladder operation, and I remember Sue Cummings coming to the room and saying, "Now, don't tell anybody Ted is here. He came home from Austria. They were there a few months." And it was a big hush-hush thing, and I couldn't understand why, because he's the ambassador to Austria. Why couldn't they say he's home with a heart attack? Well, lo and behold, about 3 months later, in Cedars-Sinai, he died of cancer. And so that was the end of the Jewish ambassador to Austria. At that time, he lived 3 months and then died in Los Angeles. And then Helene von Damme succeeded the Jewish ambassador and became the ambassador herself. And now she's objecting or saying it isn't appropriate to have a Jewish ambassador in Austria. I think it's very interesting that she allowed the first one to go, and then she took his place after this very quick death of his and met a wealthy person, one of the wealthiest in Austria, lives there now, and says, well, now you don't need a Jewish ambassador, probably because there's no one like her to succeed him, and she doesn't want a Jew there. It was very interesting that she objected now when she was the appointment secretary for Ronald Reagan in the transition team, and through the period when Ted Cummings was ambassador and died, and then was very thankful to take his position and go back to Austria where she came from. Now, there's a lot of talk of Central America in the newspapers with the plane of the Contras that just landed, with Ronald Reagan pressuring Congress for more money for the Contras, and there's going to be a big vote February the 4th on money for the Contras. And there's a magazine out, many of you know it, some of you don't, called NACLA, N-A-C-L-A. The letters stand for North American Congress on Latin America. And a friend of mine, a subscriber to World Watchers, sends me her copies. And their 20th anniversary issue that came out December 1986 has one article after the other on American imperialism and America taking over Central America and how they've destroyed certain countries in Central America and South America. And I want to recommend this issue to you because it's a very important and interesting description of situation. A lot of people like to hear Noam Chomsky talk about Central America. I think these articles are much more pertinent and to the point and direct about what is happening and how it's happening there. The address for NACLA, you can get the single issue, is 151 West 19th Street, 9th floor, New York City, New York 10011. It's $3.50 plus 90 cents for the mail, and you might ask for the 20th anniversary issue, December 1986. If I said that too fast, and I always do, then I suggest that you send a self-addressed stamped envelope to me, and I'll give you the address and tell you how to order this issue. It's a collector's item, a very good material that explains who we are and what we're doing to people in Central and South America. As if we didn't know, but it is particularly well written, and I hope you send for it. Otherwise, if some of you don't, I'll outline it for you and put some of it on the air. On the talk show part of my program that many of you subscribers don't get, when you subscribe to World Watchers, many people have called in and asked about NutraSweet, and from time to time I've mentioned NutraSweet, and I just want to bring up some more material. Some I gave you before, and addresses where you can get information. There's going to be a television program this week on People Are Talking on the West Coast on NutraSweet. One of the interesting parts of NutraSweet is a man named Earl H. Harbison, Harbison, Jr. Harbison held two positions for NutraSweet. He was in charge of the SEARLE, the company, the pharmaceutical company of G.D. SEARLE and Company, and worked for them on a board position. Then he also worked for Monsanto at the same time. Earl Harbison became the chairman of Monsanto and G.D. SEARLE when they merged, Earl B. Harbison, Jr. He was named both the chief operating officer, the president, and chief operating officer. Instead of splitting those jobs, he was named to both. He was formerly vice chairman, and he succeeded Francis Fitzgerald, who died very shortly, again like Ted Cummings in Austria. He died a month before the appointment of Harbison. Harbison's appointment, according to the Wall Street Journal, this is May the 6th, 1986, was a surprise to some analysts who presumed that Richard Mahoney, Monsanto's chairman, would resume the presidency. Mahoney had held both posts before Fitzgerald died. Now, Harbison had several jobs, as I say, with Monsanto. He was with them for 19 years. In addition to being with them 19 years, he was a former deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was also serving as G.D. SEARLE's chairman and chairman of NutraSweet, and he oversaw the merging of the G.D. SEARLE and NutraSweet with the large pharmaceutical chemical, and they were combined, and he took over this double position, having been in the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, briefly on one part of the talk show, I mentioned a newsletter, and many of you should send for this. Another subscriber to World Watcher has sent me some of these newsletters. There's one it's by a woman, Ida Honoroff, like honor off, Honorof, P.O. Box 346, Cutton, California, 95534. And it's volume 401, a report to the consumer on the FDA cover-up on the hazards of NutraSweet. And she has been putting out programs since 1979 on ecology and food and poison in our food and the dangers of the things in our environment that can hurt us. And her whole issue, if you send for it for the single issues 401, there are 4 condensed pages of NutraSweet. And she explains back in March of 1973, G.D. SEARLE, the international pharmaceutical firm, proposed issuing a food additive called aspartame NutraSweet to enhance flavor. The offices of G.D. SEARLE, interestingly enough, are in Skokie, Illinois, that I always associate as a home base for many of the Nazis in the United States of America, and a home base for Paul Marcinkus, who became a chief of the Vatican Bank, Skokie, Illinois, right out of Chicago. And she describes in her article how aspartame is 180 times as sweet as sugar, and when combined, it metabolizes as a protein, unlike sugar, which metabolizes as a carbohydrate. Then she cites certain doctors, like Dr. John Olney, who objected to the safety of NutraSweet. He's from Washington University of Medicine, St. Louis, Missouri. He teaches psychiatry and neuropathology, and was worried about the effect of NutraSweet on the mind and the brain. And he submitted that it caused lesions in the parts of the brain of animals, and it affected their neuroendocrine system, and controlled sexual desire, reproduction rather. And he went into the chemistry of NutraSweet, the dangers, and visited a former vice president of G.D. SEARLE, who said he'd look into the obvious brain damage it seemed to be doing, and then there was silence and no more contact, and then 4 years later, he found out that the FDA had approved of aspartame, and he had advised them and warned G.D. Searle, and Dr. Olney published a study, and this newsletter she has goes into the study and the dangers of NutraSweet, and she gave it to Senator of Ohio, Senator Metzenbaum. And in the congressional record, if you want to look it up, May 7th, 1985, and August 1st, 1985, there are entered some of the damages of NutraSweet, and 12 mice that were given the NutraSweet showed brain damages. And a Dr. Coulomb, Coulomb, did a study on behavioral effects in humans, and a Dr. Richard Wertman from MIT published that the evidence of aspartame may produce neurochemical changes associated with depressed seizure thresholds, and a Dr. William Partridge from UCLA talked about seizures and the effect of fetal development to pregnant women, taking in Dr. Michael Mahalik of Philadelphia and Dr. Ronald Gautieri from Temple University Pharmacy wrote about the dangers of NutraSweet, and Dr. Adrian Gross of the FDA sent a letter to Howard Metzenbaum that at least the study showed that NutraSweet aspartame was capable of inducing brain tumors in experimental animals. And a Dr. Louis Elsass of Emory University was on Nightline in May of 1985 and warned that there was a whitewash of the scientific review, that it possibly could have irreversible mental retardation, epileptic seizures, chronic eczema, skin inflammation, and the IQ of children and fetuses could be reduced. In August 1986, a Dr. H.J. Roberts of West Palm Beach charged that aspartame or NutraSweet is an imminent public health hazard, and asked them to check it out regarding seizures, blindness, depression, medical problems, hearing loss, vision problems, and said that there were 2 cases of blindness after using NutraSweet. Incidentally, a caller reminded the listeners here in Pacific Grove last week that NutraSweet is sponsoring a good part of the Olympic Games, and that is in fact true. I see it on television. I like to watch the ice skating particularly, and there's the big signs about NutraSweet for the athletes and people watching, sponsoring the games. And then this article continues that in August 1985, in the Congressional Record, it reports that there were several organizations put together, one called Aspartame Victims and Their Friends, that called attention to G.D. Searle and asked the FDA for help and challenged their claims. And then there's an Aspartame Resource Center of Community Nutrition Institute, and a James Turner, the attorney and consumer activist who wrote The Chemical Feast, filed a petition in the Justice Department about this matter, and Turner represents CNI, Community Nutrition Institute, and there have been requests for NutraSweet to be investigated. It is now put, I don't know if it always was, into Kool-Aid. Remember the nice Jonestown Kool-Aid? Well, NutraSweet won't kill you that fast, but it is put in chewing gum and all kinds of foods. The first U.S. attorney in charge of investigating this matter, there was a request for a grand jury in Chicago to see if G.D. Searle was concealing material facts and making false statements about NutraSweet and the drug aldactone. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that drug right. And the first U.S. attorney, Samuel Skinner, didn't call a grand jury. In fact, he not only didn't call a grand jury, but they found out that he was employed by the law firm of Sidley and Austin, the firm that defended Searle investigation, G.D. Searle Company, and sure enough, he joined the law firm instead of having a grand jury investigation. And then they stalled the grand jury investigation because the 5-year statute of limitations for that grand jury was running out. Then a Mr. William Conlon, the senior assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the G.D. Searle case in Chicago, stalled that investigation. And then later, 1 year later, he, like Samuel Skinner, the former U.S. attorney, joined the law firm of Sidley and Austin. G.D. Searle hired the U.S. attorney and the senior assistant U.S. attorney, and they went to work for the law firm that was representing G.D. Searle. In 1970, this report says they found a memo written by G.D. Searle people, a strategy memo on how they would get NutraSweet approved by the FDA. And, of course, if the deputy director of the CIA was Searle's chairman and chairman of NutraSweet, Mr. Earl Harbison, I bet it wouldn't be hard to have a strategy memo with the former deputy director of the CIA as chairman of your NutraSweet and your pharmaceutical company. So they committed themselves to getting a favorable review by developing links with the FDA. And, of course, this turned out to be hiring the very people that were supposed to call a grand jury on the matter. And this newsletter that Ms. Honoroff has tells you about how the investigations were stalled. And so that gives you a little view of the NutraSweet. People's Daily World, November the 7th, had an article, NutraSweet Safety is Questioned, and there was concentration, they word, of the chemical that occurs in the brain of a fetus, and the challenges were made by Dr. William Partridge, a professor of medicine, University of California in Los Angeles. And then just this past year in November 1987, there was an investigation, and Howard Metzenbaum's committee in Congress listened to the evidence, and they studied to see whether NutraSweet caused headaches, and they took several patients or people and gave them some NutraSweet, and the others had a placebo, and put them in a hospital, and they didn't get a headache. But the point about NutraSweet, it isn't something you check out. You don't have to have an instant headache. That may have been a false kind of symptom that was used, an easy one that then they could rule out, because what they were talking about was long-range damage that happens very insidiously and catches up with you years later. Washington Post, April 25th, 1986, had an article about Monsanto, the same company that joined with SEARLE and NutraSweet, Monsanto Agricultural Products Company, and this article has to do with their and testing a new kind of a microbe out in the fields, a laboratory-developed microbe. And in this same article, it includes the work of the Advanced Genetic Sciences of California that I did many broadcasts on, where they have live bacteria to put on food products as an excuse for stopping frost on the leaves. And I wonder about the safety of these matters. Washington Post said the Monsanto case is the third product to move through regulatory agencies and is the most controversially scientifically because the bacterium that they put on plants produces a poison which will kill some living things and which may remain for some time in the soil before dying. Monsanto tested the pesticide for 4 days without approval, and so did Advanced Genetic Sciences. And then there was another story, EPA stalls on genetic pesticide test. The EPA had given Monsanto and Advanced Genetic Sciences the go-ahead that they could use this live genetically altered bacteria on food. And then there was a quotation from the Washington Times. I believe it's the best interest of Monsanto and the Environmental Protection Agency that before we test more, the general public develop a feeling of trust and confidence that all decisions to permit experiments of this sort are based on expert evaluation of reliable data. So they pulled back so they could soothe us to know it was safe before they went any further with the test. And again, that's part of their PR operations to put us at ease about the dangers. The San Francisco Chronicle, October 28, 1987, had an article, The Myths and Reality of Using NutraSweet, and it goes into the possibility of mental retardation and brain damage. I don't have to go into the chemical combinations because most of you, including myself, wouldn't remember exactly what they are, but NutraSweet goes directly into the blood system, and this article brings up the problems and dangers of including it in so many different foods that we have. So that's a little bit on NutraSweet, and you requested it. I have more, and I did cite on the air just a few months ago that in a request for new biological weapons, because of the advancement of genetics and science, the Defense Department asked and listed some of the new DNA and gene-altering weapons for chemical biological warfare and suggested NutraSweet as a weapon of war, and I had that on World Watcher several months ago, so that was part of a congressional hearing, NutraSweet as a weapon. So that covers a little bit more, and for you listeners that requested it, maybe you can send for Ms. Honoroff's newsletter and get a lot more about the details of that particular substance that is in so much the food and beverages today. We'll take a 1-minute break now before I continue the second half of World Watchers. Before, I just want to mention this news announcement that was in my box that is pertinent to our interests here. The Monterey County Sanctuary, the El Refugio, invites you to a seminar on political asylum. The seminar will be held Saturday, January the 30th, this next Saturday, at 9:30 a.m. until 4 p.m. at St. Mary's by the Sea Church at 12th and Central and Pacific Grove. The seminar is sponsored by the San Francisco Lawyers Committee for Urban Affairs, the Father Moriarty Central American Refugee Program, and the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. Topics covered include asylum law overview and case theories, preparation of I-589s and the hearings appellate issues, and also affirmative applications for political asylum and other immigration remedies. The seminar guest speakers include Leslie Simon and Kate McGrath on the San Francisco Lawyers Committee for Urban Affairs, and also Karen Musallo of the Father Moriarty Refugee Program. The political asylum seminar is free to volunteers, $25 to members of the National Lawyers Guild, $40 to all others. That's an all-day conference. For more information, call the Central American Refugee Service Center at 372-4440. And maybe we can help some of these refugees that are fleeing from the death squads in El Salvador, the poverty of Central America. And if you want to get through to Congress and call about that vote on the Contra 8, the phone number 202-224-3121. The vote is February the 4th. This is our chance to show what kind of people we are and at least make our voices heard. The government, Reagan's government, has continued to send weapons to Central America. And this past week, a plane was down that just had delivered lethal weapons. There are some uncommitted votes in the House that I don't want to give all the names on the air. Well, I can do it very quickly. A few of them: Jim Leach, James Lightfoot, Representative McKay, Democrat Dan Mica, Jim Slattery from Maine, Olympia Snow from Massachusetts, Silvio Conte from Michigan, Carl Purcell, Frank Guarino, Mario Biaggi. I don't know if you will contact them or your California congressmen, the ones you want to know. There's a few more of the uncommitted, but just call up and give your support for holding back the money for the lethal aid at a time when people are trying to get some peace down there. Ronald Reagan, of course, has to interject and break it up all of the time and be the whole king of the jungle, ordering everybody's lives around at his own beck and call. Now, this morning on C-SPAN, I was watching George Shultz talk about the INF Treaty. And, of course, the president spoke this evening. I didn't get a chance to hear it. I was on the way in here, as, of course, asking for money for the military, for the Contras. And, of course, the newspapers are just filled with the candidates and the Republicans and the Democrats. And it is just terrible seeing them on television, you know, being interviewed, having their debates in Iowa and going on to the next debates this next weekend, and individual biographies and on television. These men are saying what they think should happen to America. And the truth of the matter is that the basic decisions are not made by them at all. They're made by a small clique that I want to talk about this evening because it is so dear to my heart. It's in the news now. And then next week, hopefully, we'll return again to some of the satanic cults, which are not separate from this exact team. But it's important to remember to feel, and it is true, that you are absolutely helpless unless you understand the forces that are making the determinations and the decisions for us. And you stop being helpless when you recognize where the decisions are made and try to stop that process. There was a very long article by Kenneth Sharp in the San Jose Mercury, November the 8th, titled "The Foreign Policy is Run by the Security Elite. The Iran-Contra Report is Likely to Miss the Basic Connection." And what Kenneth Sharp is saying is that the congressional committees investigating the Iran-Contra affair will warn us against dangerous tension of covert policy and constitutional democracy, and that the hearings will talk about aberrations of people, that they went outside the law, that their laws are good, and it's just bad people or maybe a few bad laws as the source of the problem. And Kenneth Sharp says they miss the point about the root of the problem, and that is the content and not the process of foreign policy, that the aberration focuses on people's failures, ignorance, overzealous patriotism, and so forth, and the legal argument that they didn't obey the laws suggests that the Founding Fathers assumed that they had control of the abuse of power and that these people unchecked will strain our institutional network the way it's set up. But what he said, what drives the security elites to abuse the constitutional authority is their domestic opposition to the policies and their unrealistic notion of what national security is, that the bombing of Cambodia, the Iran-Contra affair, is something that they want to do on their own, and that the enemy is actually the United States, that it is us they are deceiving and keeping the information from. And he goes into the fact that when Richard Nixon was in trouble, that the enemy was the American people, that he knew that the congressional opposition would be mobilized against what he did, and all of his actions were to control the minds of the domestic anti-war protesters at home and to control the people, and that he was determined to uphold credibility at all times, that we are free people, that Americans are free, that we have democratic institutions, that we choose who we elect, but that illegally they could wiretap and they could control what we see or hear and treat us like third world countries. And the major attempt was to stop American people from knowing what was going on in their own country. And the unraveling at the time of Watergate was a major attempt to bring home the very anti-democratic processes and unconstitutional operations used aboard. It wasn't the problem of covert operations that are legal or useful, but the unconstitutional ones that we use overseas are brought home to us at home. And this article says that in every case where there are problems at home, the domestic opposition leads the security elite to undertake more and more anti-democratic and unconstitutional actions. And the opposition is in our looking at us at home and using the excuse of national security. And then this article goes on to say, since World War II, the U.S. policy towards the third world was guided by presumption. We have the right, we have the responsibility, we have the power to control the internal character of every regime, to get the leftist revolutionaries out of power, and also to do it in the United States, where people make intelligence choices. They think they have the power under the guise of national security to tell us what is going on. Now, since World War II, translated means since Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence east, came to the United States with other top Nazis of the Waffen-SS and literally rewrote our national constitution by making a national security council that never was there before. And then they could do all the aberrations. And the problem is that our foreign policy is made by this elite who have decided to impose our will, their will, on anybody, not only overseas, but at home. And they can install any government they want, and whether it's Guatemala or the United States, and their efforts to carry out their goals are unrealistic, because once in a while Congress pops its head up and says what is going on, and the argument of national security is not pertinent to these matters. And the conclusion of this article is that the real solution is not getting new people in or passing new laws, but a serious challenge to the fundamental assumptions of United States foreign policy. As long as the United States insists on exercising control in the third world, or even places, the Philippines or Iran, or all over the world, the countries that we control, everywhere, whether it doesn't matter which country we control it, as long as we insist on controlling these countries, the cost at home will keep generating strong domestic opposition. The security elites define this opposition as dangerous to the programs that they call national security, and they will have an incentive to take action that threatens constitutional democracy. And those who want to seek to protect the Constitution have to constantly come in and say, are we doing this for anti-communism, or must we protect ourselves? And the gist of this article is that a small elite clique are running this country. Now, several months ago in November, I had on World Watchers the fact that a new group was selected by Ronald Reagan just at the time of the heat of the Iran-Contra affair, as it was winding down, to select a committee to decide the foreign policy for the next 20 years. Remember, the long listeners of World Watchers, that I had that on the air. And, of course, they did get together, and their report was given to the president this week. The group is called the Commission on Integrated long-term strategy. And it has 13 experts, and the head of the policy of this commission was Fred IKLE, I-K-L-E. He was very much part of the Iran-Contra affair mess in the Defense Department and the National Security. And Fred IKLE chaired a 13-member committee, and on the committee is the well-known Henry Kissinger, who runs most affairs international in this world, Zbigniew Brzezinski, retired Army General John Vesey, W. Graham Claytor, Deputy Secretary of Defense, and the co-chairman was Alman Holstetter, W-O-H-L-S-T-T-E-R. There were 2 retired generals, an admiral, and then it was also co-chairman, one of the important people with Brzezinski, Kissinger, Vesey is Reagan's old pal William Clark, former National Security Advisor, who suggested that all the Iran-Contras get a pardon immediately. And William Clark, through military intelligence, brought the notorious Helene von Dahm into this country, where she connected with Otto von Bolschwing in Sacramento and made this connection with Ronald Reagan. He brought her as part of military intelligence. Now, this committee issued a report on what they're going to do with America, and it's pertinent because of the INF Treaty, whether it is signed by the House and Senate or not, and the discussion of it in the summit. This article, there's several articles that were in the paper this past month. Pentagon plan to move away from N-arms. This article from the San Francisco Examiner says the blueprint of the Commission on Integrated Long-Term Strategy outlines a new generation of brilliant, in quotes, brilliant, their own, conventional weapons. And they tell you, and you can't call it the secret team because they tell you what they're going to do. The first article says the Pentagon, anxious to broaden its ability to attack the Soviet Union. This is right there for, the first war, first strike, attack the Soviet Union, so don't get taken in by the INF Treaty, and whether it's ratified or not. The Pentagon, anxious to broaden its ability to attack the Soviet Union, is moving to augment the nation's doomsday nuclear arsenal, and they'll put that away with a multi-million-dollar array of brilliant non-nuclear capable of striking within 3 feet of targets in the Soviet Union. The plan to develop a new generation of devastating conventional ammunition for striking Soviet territory will be added to the existing arsenal of nuclear forces. It emerges past Tuesday in the blueprint for U.S. defenses of the 21st century. The United States relied too long on the do-or-die nuclear weapons. The Commission on Integrated Long-Term Strategy, with 13 members from the Defense Department, said that this plan is sorely needed. Atomic weapons are out. Forget about atomic weapons. With arms agreements raising the possibility of reducing nuclear forces, the Pentagon has commissioned a variety of highly classified projects to develop conventional explosives, guidance systems capable of striking deep within Soviet territory. Advanced missile accuracy makes the atomic weapons that we had non-functional anyway. So while there's so much bravado about signing a piece of paper between Mr. Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, they already know what they're going to do. There are further refinements on Tomahawk cruise missiles to deliver high explosives, as I say, from 3 to 9 feet. The precision associated with the new technology will enable us to use conventional weapons and many of the missions once assigned to nuclear weapons. The most immediate use for such highly accurate conventional weapons may be to defend the United States in the Third World, and U.S. warships operating in the Persian Gulf region would be armed with such material to strike within 3 feet of a target in Russia. Missiles with conventional warheads could be readily used by the United States in early stages of a crisis. The panel conceded that its outline would have little immediate effect on military planning, with presidential campaigns or the next administration most likely to use the document as a guideline, because this 69-page outline is for 20 years up through the year 2000 and more, and this is what will be presented to as whoever is the President of the United States, whether it's Senator Gore or whether it's George Bush, whoever is the President of the United States will be told this is what you have to do, just as the plans to invade Cuba were laid out by the CIA and Allen Dulles and Richard Nixon. They told John Kennedy he had to do it, and when he pulled back, he had his head blown off. Another article in Wall Street Journal about the panel says Pentagon panel urges better strategies to deal with conflicts of the Third World. And this is so pathetic because these generals and admirals, and they're all white, that nobody comes from these areas, the third world countries, to represent their interests or their feelings or their repressions. And they've made plans on how to control every third world country and the means to do it and the weapons and the technology, which means that not only the elected democracies are plowed under, but the people that want to have a chance to start in each of these various countries where there's so much starvation, illiteracy, and so forth, have no idea that their future has been charted out by Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski and 11 other people. The Wall Street Journal says the Pentagon Commission warned that U.S. influence around the globe will decline unless this country sharpens its strategy for dealing in wars in the third world, as if we needed that. The commission established to study military strategies for the next century, called on the Defense Department to broaden its focus for an all-out war emphasis from the current all-out war to smaller conflicts that erupt in developing worlds. They are obviously less threatening than a Soviet-American war would be, yet they have an accumulative adverse effect on U.S. access to critical regions, on American credibility among its allies and friends, and on American self-confidence. And you know there was nothing like Grenada for American self-confidence for us to run in and just decimate the place, and that made us look strong again. The Wall Street Journal says the commission cited several trends and suggested that we might have a waning U.S. influence in developing countries and that a number of U.S. military officers in friendly countries might decline. So the U.S. military has to train people to send into the third world, as we did in 1970, and we're losing valuable links to military officers in U.S. bases. The commission, headed by Fred IKLE, he's a Swiss banking family, Defense Undersecretary, and Albert Wohlstetter, an authority on military strategy, said that the Pentagon is stumbling to establish an organization and a strategy to deal with guerrilla movements, low-intensity conflicts that often erupt in third world. And a year after Congress enacted legislation to set up a new defense organization to oversee these special operations, and that is in conflict right now, the appointment of this particular group, the Pentagon is coordinating a program. The gentleman in question here is Kenneth Berquist, and I did a broadcast about him before, Berquist. He's from the Delta Force from Vietnam, from the Ollie North Michael Aquino School of the Phoenix Program and Terrorism. Kenneth Berquist was selected by this clique and by Frank Carlucci, and the Justice Department officially nominated him for the post to be in charge of guerrilla low-intensity conflicts all over the world, to put down the native populations and have these special operation units going. Mr. Berquist's nomination is trouble. He faces opposition in Congress, and there are a lot of people that are not confident in his having this position, and they may leave the job vacant for a while. He's very controversial. Now, an article followed this at the same time this report came out by 5 days that Fred IKLE was stepping down. He has been close to Zbigniew Brzezinski and Richard Pearl, the Prince of Darkness. Mr. Michael Aquino calls himself the Prince of Darkness. So does Richard Pearl. They're both of the same ilk. And as soon as this group was put together, Fred IKLE, the Undersecretary of Defense, said that he's going to retire from the Pentagon. He's leaving the Reagan administration. Now, there is no need for jumping up and down and joyfully waving your hands. Fred IKLE's out, he's out. Because you remember when General Secord came home from Southeast Asia in the Phoenix program and was linked to the various narcotic traffickers and torturers and murderers. He said he retired from the Air Force in 1983, at which point he went into the anti-terrorist unit, terrorism equating drug traffic and repressions. And Secord then moved on to the National Security Council, so he wasn't even on the payroll of the Pentagon. He was employee of the government, and now with Albert Hakim has sequestered $6 or $7 million of his own, held at Merrill Lynch in London. But it's interesting that Richard Pearl and Fred IKLE and John Lehman, the Secretary of the Navy, these three have left the Reagan administration, but don't believe they have left. I believe they've gone from the Pentagon to the National Security Council, the National Security Agency. And the interesting part about Fred IKLE leaving 5 days after his commission was put together, it was the New York Times that said policy decisions in IKLE's office will be managed for the rest of the year by Richard Armitage, Assistant Secretary for Defense for International Security Affairs, and Ronald Lehman, recently named by Frank Carlucci as Assistant Secretary for International Security Policy. Armitage is one of the Pentagon's most influential policymakers, especially on foreign aid and covert operations. Now, that is the Richard Armitage named by Bo Gritz as being part of the drug traffic, working with Kunsa and Theodore Shackley, bringing a lot of narcotics into this country. And he is linked to not only to the Middle East, to Southeast Asia drug traffic, but to the Middle East, the drug of Kunsa into the Middle East and back to the United States through that route, which I'll get to in a moment. So Armitage is not being kicked out. Ross Perot, who is a staunch conservative Republican, went to Washington and went to the Reagans because Mrs. Reagan has been saying, say no to drugs, and he asked them to go into the drug trafficking allegations of Richard Armitage, and they told him to butt off. Frank Carlucci said, get out of it, and the White House said, get out of it, and Ross Perot came back disappointed because of the hard evidence of the drug trafficking control of Armitage. So that by Fred IKLE leaving and turning his job over to Armitage, it means exactly that the drug dealers are moving up into the Defense Department. And when Martha Mitchell said at the time of the water break-ins that the mafia was in the White House, she got a needle in her fanny and died of cancer. A few years later, got injected, and it seems that Fred IKLE has moved over to let Armitage in a position where he should be investigated on the charges of the drug trafficking with Kunsa and Theodore Shackley. But instead of that, he's moving into a higher position in the Defense Department, so-called terrorism. The terrorism unit is the drug traffic unit, and Armitage was also in the Middle East with Oliver North when they were getting a ship and buying weapons for the Contras from the largest drug trafficker in Syria, linked to the terrorism of Killy-Laura and the terrorism of the Middle East. So the Defense Department not only has a plan for the next 20 years set up by war criminals such as Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, but they have Armitage, the drug dealer, and of course where these people have taken countries such as Iran. The drug traffic poured into this country, Southeast Asia. When we got in there, the drugs came in. When we went into Central America, in Bolivia and Brazil, the drugs poured into the United States. When we were working in Laos and allegedly trying to help the Laotians with a conflict against communism, and came the Nugan Bank in Australia, and the drugs pouring into the United States. And wherever we have had military action, it seems to be for the purpose of increasing the profit of the drug profiteers. There was an article in Spotlight magazine in May 1987 about a mystery man, Noel Koch, who was faceless until the Iran hearings, and then his face was seen on the television screen. He testified, and Noel Koch was in charge of counterterrorism for Ronald Reagan, and he served also in the Defense Department policy under Secretary Fred IKLE, and worked with him. And these people have been close to the Mossad in Italy, and they've been close to the drug traffic and the Defense Department. And there's a nest of people who, if they're leaving, we have to watch them if possible. We won't know where they are unless there's a scandal that comes up a few years later. But Noel Koch, the mystery man, was involved with the arms to the Ayatollah Khomeini, and also that group diverted the money down to Central America, worked under Fred IKLE, and was part of the Criminal Investigation Division. And Koch was a fundraiser for Nixon. But the important thing is that he worked closely with Richard Perle, International Security Policy Assistant Secretary in that, and that Fred IKLE, who set up this commission with the policies for the next 20 years as chairman of that group, has worked with these mystery people who were involved with the Iran-Contra affair, and he seems qualified to decide our policy for the next years. There also was another story on this matter in the Los Angeles Times. United States urged to revise security plans for the future. It's about the Blue Ribbon Bipartisan Committee, who laid out their coherent and integrated strategy for a wide range of conflicts that the nation would fight. Low-intensity conflicts will continue. A 69-page report of the commission details 8 separate topics and their plans for the future. and how we will aid the anti-communist guerrillas in all these various countries, and how this plan for the next 20 years includes the control of space in wartime. That is increasingly vital, and the United States has satellites to monitor arms control treaties and give warning of a nuclear attack, but we will need the control of space for wartime, and it also has to do with a first strike, this committee, a first strike against the Soviet Union. Among its major points, the Commission includes a wider range of contingencies in two extreme threats, an all-out nuclear war and a massive conventional Soviet invasion of Central Europe. What would we do? And therefore, we need a first strike. And then this low-intensity conflict is the form of warfare in which the enemy is more or less omnipresent, unlikely ever to surrender. Those are the poor people who have nothing to lose by fighting. The report says that such conflicts we should view as protracted wars, like the 20-year war, like the PLO against Israel. That will be a protracted war. They will go on unending and continue on and on. So they have set aside areas where there will be protracted conflict. That's why we arm Iraq and Iran at the same time, to get our ships in the Gulf, and protracted conflicts wherever the situation arises, that we can step in, send arms to both sides, and keep it going indefinitely. And this is barbaric. People just dying like flies across the globe. Terrible, phony elections. You see the election in Haiti, where 34 or 40 people were killed. In the Philippines, 80 were killed. The countries like Paraguay have no elections. The election frauds where people are killed in violence. In South Korea, our so-called allies having these wonderful elections that are total fraud. And then we must look at ourselves and say, are our elections a fraud? Because whoever gets in, the policies are made by this team. And if whoever is elected doesn't take their orders, they'll get their heads blown off like John Kennedy's did. And in conclusion, I just want to cite an article from a newspaper in Rome, April the 8th, 1987, sent to me by a listener who does translations for me and David Emery, about the warlords of the Middle East, the terrorists, the Sicilians and the Golden Triangles, the group that are on trial, the Stibaum group in Italy, and how they went to Thailand to meet Kung Sa. And Kung Sa was sending his narcotics then into Europe from the Golden Triangle. And, of course, this opium is tied to the Vatican, the P2, and the powers that be in Italy that we've done so much about in regarding the politics of Italy. And that also ties in the drug traffic that Mr. Armitage is involved in. Well, this concludes the first part of World Watchers. These events of the next 20 years, I think, are important to sit back and see how the policies are made by a handful of people. It is really pathetic. In conclusion, I want to say the previous hour of World Watchers has been made possible in part by Aries Arts in the heart of Capitola Village, serving Santa Cruz's growing consciousness for over 20 years. My name is Mae Brussell. The program is World Watchers. The first hour is news. The second hour is your chance to call in, tell me what you're thinking and seeing and feeling about. There's certainly so much, and I can't cover it in the first hour. So hang in there. Be ready to call 375-3082, and I'll be back with you in about 2 minutes.